Next we have Mathieu from Smart. So Mathieu is studio director at Smart with over 20 years experience. His design work has resulted in some of Smart's most progressive residential and commercial high-rise projects and competition wins. His work includes, spoiler alert, the Opal Tower at Sydney Olympic Park, 1 Denison Street, North Sydney, and the super high-rise scheme for 8 Parramatta Square. He has a special interest in developing new high-rise typologies with innovative residential and commercial floor plates to increase density and urbanisation, lower environmental impact and improve the everyday life of users. Thank you, Mathieu.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you very much. Just before I start, if I could let everyone know that I've just completed 3 weeks of recovering from laryngitis. I don't know if my voice is going to make it through the rest of the night, but if anyone saw me sculling from a brown bottle in my shoulder bag about 15 minutes ago, I can assure you it was only cough mixture. I feel fabulous, but I don't know if it's going to hold up. Let's see. I think if we were to outline 2 things that we were really trying to achieve with the design of the Opal Tower from day one, the first would be that we wanted to enhance the degree of amenity that was available to residents in typical residential condominium towers. Obviously, when faced with a design competition for a residential tower, there are many different facets that you can look at being unique and being special, I guess, or unusual in the marketplace. What we really tried to do was drive an approach here that this should be a tower that offered outstanding amenity to residents. What really struck me about Sydney Olympic Park when I went to go and visit it the first time was just that, the amenity of the location, the amount of open space, the amount of sunlight, the amount of views, the amount of greenery. If we could just increase the quality of life above the average apartment building in this building by just 1 notch, we felt that we would be happy with the result. The second thing that we really sought to do was to create a building which is truly of its place, and that means a building that if you were to pick it up and put it somewhere else, it should fail, it should not be relevant, it should not belong in that location. It should be something which is truly of its place. Our vision, we've said, is that Site 68, or Opal Tower, is where Olympic Park meets Bicentennial Park, where the city meets nature. It is simultaneously the edge condition, entry marker, and gateway. In response, we've created a unique triangular-shaped tower that is a slender entry marker to Olympic Park, while also responding to its pivotal location. The soft corners reflect the elliptical towers further along Australia Avenue, while vertical gardens and horizontal planters continue the landscape of Bicentennial Parklands into the 3rd dimension, up into the building. Environmentally, our design cleans, filters and cools air, provides cross-flow ventilation to apartments and common areas, shades apartments in summer while admitting winter sunlight. The building will be the next generation of environmental apartment living at Olympic Park. Here is the location. Do I have a pointer? I'm not sure. Yeah. Yeah. Obviously, this is the site location, and what immediately struck us was the absolute panoramic views towards the south and towards the east of the site. This is Bicentennial Park. It will never be built out. You can see the Parramatta River effectively from the site. This is Sydney Olympic Park in this area here, and the whole of Sydney Olympic Park has a master plan called Sydney Olympic Park 2030, which envisages the largest proportion of this area becoming high-rise commercial and residential development. So what we really had was, a building or a site that was at the perimeter of Sydney Olympic Park, separating Sydney Olympic Park from the Bicentennial Parklands. And if anyone can understand why I've just gotten a little nervous and stumbled over a few words, it's because I saw my boss walk in through the corridor just there a second ago, so bear with me. The site is also very much at a prominent corner between Australia Avenue and Bennelong Parkway, and it effectively represents a gateway into Sydney Olympic Park. When you arrive into Sydney Olympic Park to go to one of the main stadiums, particularly from eastern Sydney, you arrive along Australia Avenue, and Site 68 is the very first site which you come across. So therefore, we've said that this is a gateway building, and that the building itself should represent the fact that you've arrived in Sydney Olympic Park. The site itself sits on an axis between Australia Avenue, the Bicentennial Parklands, which is a pedestrian route running right the way through the parklands connecting to a railway station, and obviously has a corner interface along here in the 3rd axis. The site also sits at the end of a string of towers along Australia Avenue. Australia Avenue continues up towards the railway station and the town centre of Sydney Olympic Park. There are a number of tall residential buildings already built. This building would be the final in a string of tall towers along Australia Avenue. The site had excellent solar access, obviously from the west round to the north and around towards the east. Interestingly, being an existing stormwater detention basin, the site had quite a steep embankment around the perimeter of it, reducing the actual buildable footprint insofar as the natural ground levels were concerned once the stormwater detention basin was filled in. Views from the site were primarily towards the north, and right round towards the east and towards the south. Towards the southeast were the best views. That's where we had distant city views. You could see the whole city skyline in this orientation. We could see Bicentennial Park towards the south, and we could see over towards the Parramatta River up towards the northeast. So you can see the views were very much in one particular direction and less so in the other direction. And if I show you what those actual views were taken, were looking like, taken from the residential building behind Australia Towers, you can see this is the Rhodes waterfront here and the Parramatta River. And then we come around down towards the south where we start to see the Sydney CBD on the skyline. And you can see all of this would never be built out. So whoever was going to live up here was going to enjoy this panoramic view, looking out onto greenery, looking out onto nature, and never be built out. At the opposite end of the site, on the western side, there was an existing railway line, which is quite a busy railway line. It's the main railway bringing trains into Sydney Olympic Park, which was a source of noise. And also we know that we need to be at least 20 metres away from any railway line in order to allow operable windows within a residential development without restrictors, etc., to avoid people throwing things onto the tracks. The envelope as prescribed under Master Plan 2030 for Sydney Olympic Park actually envisaged a 90-metre tall tower on the corner here at the intersection and a 15-metre tall zone or a 4-storey zone running right the way along Bennelong Parkway. We challenged this and we proposed that being a gateway building, being a building at the end of a string of tall towers, we felt we could achieve a better outcome for this site by scooping up all of this density in the 4-storey wall and putting it on the top of the tower, increasing the height of the tower to 103 metres. The brief for the competition also called for a childcare centre, and the childcare centre we proposed be located here in a new area of public domain or park in front of the tower, as a standalone building, which was legible as a community building in itself and which sat at the entrance into the new development interfacing with the future community opposite. We also knew that existing cycle routes running around the perimeter of the site and the new railway underpass coming through the railway line, providing DDA access from Sydney Olympic Park right the way through into the Bicentennial Parklands, would run through this site and needed to be accommodated in our design. So really what we were left with was not much site left over in terms of where we thought the building should go. We knew the building effectively could not sit on the steep topography. It needed to be a particular distance from the railway line. We had a DDA route running through. Very quickly we had a corner of the site that seemed like the right area to place the building. We then looked at what the amenity available at that portion of the site was, and we could see that we had very good solar access towards the north and east. I'll accelerate. We had very good views towards the east and the south. Obviously solar access north and east and south for the views. We studied a whole series of different options in terms of how the amenity of different floor plate configurations could work. In a triangular site, we started with a triangle and we looked at what percentage of the floor plate could achieve solar access, what percentage would be affected by noise, what percentage could achieve views. And we studied a number of different floor plate types to understand, and then assessed via our own sort of internal discussion matrix. We came to the conclusion when balancing all of these issues that on balance, the triangular form represented the greatest outcome insofar as amenity and also in terms of the civic legibility of the tower form. Having established that a triangular form was the direction we were going to proceed in, we then looked at quite a number of different massing configurations to work out what actual form would the floor plate take. Did we have soft corners, hard corners? This was a boomerang scheme we had for a little while. In principle, we started with an equilateral triangle. We rounded the edges of that equilateral triangle for two reasons. Number one, to reduce the wind loads and the wind speeds around the perimeter of the tower and improve the amenity of balconies on those corners. Secondly, also in a reference to the curved residential buildings further along Australia Avenue, and also the curved sports geometry buildings, sports buildings in Sydney Olympic Park. We then introduced 3 deep cuts or slots into the floor plate, and these were intended to bring daylight and natural ventilation deep into the core. I mentioned earlier that we were really trying to design a building that was of its place, and what we couldn't ignore at this particular point was that this building was in an enormous amount of greenery. It was surrounded by parkland, and the building itself would be sitting in a park. So we started to think to ourselves, how can we make the building speak to its context? How can we bring the context into the building? And the way we started to think of the floor plate was as 3 leaves that gradually came together to form a triangle, to wrap around a core. And then once we introduced the slots into the core, you could see that we effectively had 3 leaves of accommodation wrapped around a central core with slots which enabled light and ventilation to get into the core at 3 points along each of the corridors. We then started to look at how we could articulate this floor plate. The first thing we did is study the unit mix and work out how many apartment types we needed of different quantities and on what floors they were going to go. And we were actually able to come up with a very rational way of breaking down the vertical bulk and scale of the building into a series of stacked volumes, which exactly relate to the different types of floor plates. So there are 5 different types of floor plates in here, expressed by these stacked volumes. And then we alternated the slots on every floor so that the garden slots between each stack would alternate around the tower to create a dynamic movement of the garden slots as you moved up the building. The resulting form was one which presented an entry gateway and responded to the 3 axes of Sydney Olympic Park: Australia Avenue, Bicentennial Park, parklands here, the Bicentennial Park route, and Australia Avenue in this direction here. So it was a corner or a gateway building, emphasising its central location on those 3 axes. It was also a pivotal location at the corner as you arrive into Sydney Olympic Park. On the corner of Australia Avenue and Bicentennial Park, we had a soft corner which addressed the corner visible as you approached along Australia Avenue. And the third move we made then in terms of the architecture of the building was to try and invite some of the parkland up into the building. How could we bring some of the place into the building to inform what its character would be? This is the rendering of the building as it was proposed. You can see here that the garden slots are proposed as communal recreation areas within the tower. There are 3 on every floor plate. The bottom level of each slot is accessible to residents in the form of a courtyard. So I think there are 1, 2, 3, 4 times 3 sides, 12 gardens within this building, 12 residential gardens. The idea behind these gardens was that it didn't matter whether you could afford to buy a penthouse at the top floor with a harbour view and fantastic solar access and a view over Sydney Olympic Park, or if you could only afford a 1-bedroom apartment on level 1 that looked west into the railway line. Our intention was to make sure that every resident in this building could experience solar access, every resident in this building could experience harbour views, every resident of this building could experience views of Bicentennial Park by moving throughout the building and taking advantage of these communal gardens in the sky. These gardens which allowed light and ventilation deep into the floor plates, but also which manifested themselves as places for the community to gather and communal areas within a building to enhance the amenity of all of the residents within. This is another image from Bicentennial Park looking back at the string of towers. You can see here, actually, this is interesting. This was our competition floor plate, and I've left this as raw as it is. And you can see that we have 1 garden slot here, 1 garden slot here, literally as a result of having to fit the yield in the building. To be completely honest with you, we had to fake a slot. And you can see there's a 1-bedroom apartment that's tucked in there. And we turned up to the design presentation on day 1 and we said, we've had to fake a slot in order to stay within the height limit that we've proposed. Would you please allow us to add an extra 2 stories onto the building to free up this 3rd garden slot here and bring an extra source of light and ventilation into the corridor, and to My absolute, I was speechless when I heard the response. They said, please go away and do this. Yes, we'll give you the extra 2 stories in terms of height limit. Please allow the building to be what the building wants to be. That was a very memorable moment for this project. You can see the slots obviously alternate as we go between low-rise and high-rise floors, very simply for residential lifts coming up into very generous floor plates that have curved corners, daylight coming through, natural ventilation coming through, access out into the garden slots, compact scissor stair in the centre. And fundamental to our planning approach was a desire to make sure that despite the tower was an unusual triangular form with curved corners, we were trying to ensure that the planning was as regular and as orthogonal as we could possibly achieve. So then we come to how the exterior of the building evolved, and I think that's really a story about understanding and looking at the context. And looking through Bicentennial Park, we became very aware of the number of Australian species of trees, the colours and textures of the mangroves particularly, which were directly opposite the site. And you can see through abstracting a series of photographs that we took on a site walk, looking at the different types of mangroves and the different types of plantations that were in the Bicentennial Parklands. We were able to extract those, digitalise them, basically distill them down into a series of key colours that we thought would make this building of its place. This is a very simple diagram from competition stage, just showing how that colour would be applied into the spandrel of the building. These were operable windows along above a high-level fin. We had a low-level fin here with operable windows at the lower level to allow ventilation through upper and lower levels. The horizontal fin would change in colour as it wrapped around the building. And you can see this particular matrix was the pattern that was applied to the building. And the pattern was informed through studying the bark of the trees in Bicentennial Park, looking at the patterns within the bark and applying our 3 green colours in a pattern which was reminiscent of the bark that we had studied, but also making sure obviously that it lined up and could be a truly 360-degree pattern. So really the green, or the rigour in the green, has come out as a result of attempting to be the colours of Bicentennial Park mapped onto the bark of the trees within it. Originally we had proposed that the garden slots here, the communal gardens, would be green landscaped planted walls. We introduced our client to Patrick LeBlanc, which is a funny story for another day, and for maintenance reasons the green walls weren't able to be pursued, but we revisited the concept after the competition stage and adopted basically a colour palette of eucalyptus leaves, which again have been inspired by the context of Sydney Olympic Park, and used precast concrete within those garden slot areas. Insofar as the ground plane is concerned, I'll just do this very, very briefly. We worked with Turf and a group called Aquatica, who came up with some really beautiful ideas. This was a stormwater detention basin, and the stormwater basin was replaced by a giant concrete tank underground, but all of these parkland areas here are actually water ponds. These are biofiltration wetlands right the way through this park. There are a lot more of them now than there were in this image. All of the stormwater that was flowing into the initial pond now comes to the surface and is filtered by all of the wetlands here. The wetlands filter the water in the same way as the previous pond did, and the large water feature that you'll see on the corner when you drive out to see the building actually oxygenates the runoff water from Sydney Olympic Park, therefore being the tertiary stage in its cleaning before the water is discharged over into Sydney Harbour. These were a couple of renderings from the competition scheme. And just last week, actually, we had a photographer go out onto site. The project is now effectively complete. Residents have moved in only in the last couple of weeks. It's quite noticeable. Every time I drive out to Western Sydney, it just cropped up on me. It's difficult to miss when you're heading west. But we're very happy with the quality of the facade. We're very happy with the legibility of the spaces. You can see, I honestly think that the most amazing thing about this particular tower is what it has delivered in terms of its gesture and its contribution back to the community. Not only has it delivered a tower which has equal spaces for everyone, but it's actually delivered an entire park, a childcare centre, a railway underpass through here up to the train station, a new pedestrian bridge right the way across to Bicentennial Parklands, a water feature, a water filtration and polishing facility, all from one residential building. And I think that's a credit to our client at Ecove. They've been fantastic clients to work with, and thank you very much, everyone, for your time.
Thanks, Matthew.